Can I just sleep here tonight? I sleep better when I hear engines.
The boy was 12, alone, holding a pillow like a shield. The bikers didn't ask questions. They set up a cot between two Harleys and left an engine running. Weeks later, they discovered the heartbreaking reason why. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops when the boy appeared at the chain-link fence. He stood there without moving, backpack hanging off one shoulder, a pillow pressed against his chest like a shield. The fabric was faded, the stuffing flat from years of use, but he held it the way someone might hold something precious. Inside the lot, the Grey Pines MC was winding down from another Saturday. The smell of motor oil and exhaust hung in the cooling air. 3 bikes sat in various stages of repair, and the men moved between them with the easy rhythm of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Dutch noticed him first. He wiped his hands on a rag and squinted toward the fence, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Kid, alone, just standing there like he was waiting for permission to exist. "Hey!" Dutch called out, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You lost." The boy shook his head. He couldn't have been more than 12, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed too old for his face. He didn't look scared. He looked careful, which was worse. Like someone who had memorized every exit before choosing where to stand. "Can I just sleep here tonight?" the boy asked. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "I sleep better when I hear engines." The words hung in the air, strange and specific. Dutch exchanged a glance with Gary, who had stopped mid-wrench to listen. Behind them, 2 other members, Sal and a younger guy named Marcus, drifted closer, curiosity pulling them in. "Kid, this isn't a hotel," Dutch said, but there was no edge to it. "Where are your parents?" "My mom's working. She knows I'm out." The boy shifted his weight, adjusting the backpack strap. "I won't touch anything. I just need somewhere to sleep." Gary stepped forward, wiping grease from his fingers. He had 2 grown kids of his own, both living out of state now, and something about this boy's stillness reached him in a way he couldn't name. "What's your name?" "Lucas." Gary noticed the boy's sneakers, worn at the heels, laces knotted where they'd snapped. He remembered buying his own son new shoes every 6 months, how fast kids outgrew things. He wondered when someone had last checked if Lucas's fit. "Lucas," Gary repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "You walked here by yourself?" A nod. 6 blocks. It's not far." The men looked at each other again. This wasn't something they were prepared for. The Grey Pines MC had a reputation in town. More grease than glamour, and certainly not the first place you'd send a child for safety. They fixed bikes, organized charity rides, and kept mostly to themselves. They were not, by any definition, babysitters. It was Leonora who settled the matter. She had been inside the small kitchen attached to the garage, cleaning up after feeding the crew, when she heard the conversation through the open window. Now she stepped out, drying her hands on a dish towel, her silver hair pulled back in a loose braid. Leonora had spent 23 years as a paramedic before retiring to cook for the club. She had seen every kind of hurt a person could carry, and she recognized something in this boy that the others might have missed. She recognized exhaustion wearing a mask of composure, the kind that comes from carrying weight no one else can see. "You eaten anything today?" she asked, her tone gentle but direct. Lucas hesitated. "I had lunch." "That's not what I asked." She gestured toward the garage. "Come on. I've got leftovers that need finishing, and you look like you could use a plate." The boy glanced at Dutch, as if waiting for the final word. Dutch sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and nodded. "Go on. But we're calling your mom to make sure she knows where you are." Lucas followed Leonora inside without argument. The men watched him go, this small figure carrying his pillow like it was the only thing in the world that belonged to him. Gary was the first to speak. "What do you think that's about?" Dutch shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but something's not right at home. You can see it in the way he holds himself." They didn't push that night. They let Lucas eat his reheated stew in silence, let him flip through an old motorcycle magazine while Leonora made quiet small talk about nothing important. When his eyes started to droop, Gary cleared a space near the parts shed, a corner sheltered from the wind but still close enough to hear the bikes. They set up a cot between two Harleys, spread a clean blanket over it, and left the garage door cracked open just enough to let the night air drift through. Lucas lay down without a word. He placed his pillow carefully, pulled the blanket to his chin, and closed his eyes. 15 minutes later, Gary started one of the bikes, just to check the timing, he said. The engine rumbled low and steady, filling the space with sound. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Lucas's shoulders relaxed completely. He was asleep within minutes. The men finished their work in near silence, stealing glances at the boy who had wandered into their world with a request none of them fully understood. They didn't know his story yet. They didn't know what had driven him 6 blocks through the darkening streets to sleep among strangers and machines. But they knew one thing. Whatever this boy was running from, he had found something here that felt like safety. And that was enough for now. The following Saturday, Lucas came back. He appeared at the same hour, just as the light was fading, with the same backpack and the same flat pillow. This time he also carried a stack of comic books held together with a rubber band. He didn't ask permission again, just walked through the gate that someone had left open and settled into his corner near the parts shed. Gary watched him from across the lot, a socket wrench frozen in his hand. He had thought about the boy all week, wondered if he'd made it home safely that Sunday morning, wondered what kind of life sends a 12-year-old searching for comfort in a motorcycle garage. "He's back," Sal said, stating the obvious. "I can see that." Dutch emerged from the office, a clipboard in hand, and paused when he spotted Lucas. The boy had already opened one of his comics, knees pulled up to his chest, reading like the pages were the only real thing in the room. There was something almost practiced about his invisibility, the way he made himself small, unobtrusive, easy to overlook. "Did anyone call his mother last week?" Dutch asked. Leonora appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her apron. "I spoke with her. Andrea. She works nights at the distribution center on Miller Road. Double shifts most weeks." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "She said Lucas has trouble sleeping at home. Bad dreams." She didn't go into details, but she sounded tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Dutch nodded slowly, processing this. "So she knows he's here." "She knows. And she's grateful someone's looking out for him." The men returned to their work, but the energy had shifted. Lucas was no longer a strange occurrence. He was becoming part of their Saturday rhythm. And with that came an unspoken responsibility none of them had signed up for, but none of them seemed willing to refuse. Over the following weeks, the pattern solidified. Lucas arrived at dusk. He never asked for food, though Leonora always left a plate within reach. He never complained about the hard cot or the smell of gasoline. He simply existed in his corner, reading his comics, waiting for the engines to lull him to sleep. Gary found himself paying closer attention. He noticed how Lucas flinched whenever someone dropped a tool or raised their voice unexpectedly. How the boy's whole body would tense at the sound of a car door slamming in the distance. But when Marcus revved his bike to test a new exhaust system, Lucas didn't flinch at all. If anything, he leaned toward the sound, his shoulders dropping, his breathing slowing. It was Leonora who put it into words one evening, standing beside Gary while Lucas dozed under a wool blanket. "Loud isn't what scares him," she said quietly. "It's the quiet, the waiting, the not knowing what's coming next." Gary understood then. The rumble of engines was predictable chaos, noise that announced itself, that filled every corner, that left no room for surprises. For a boy who had learned to fear silence, that kind of sound wasn't a disturbance. It was a promise that nothing could sneak up on him while he slept. By the 4th week, Lucas had started talking more. Not much, just fragments offered between panels of his comic books. He mentioned his school, a teacher he liked, a video game he wished he could afford. Small things. The kind of details that reminded Gary this was still a 12-year-old despite everything. One evening, Gary sat down beside him with 2 bottles of root beer. He handed one to Lucas without ceremony and opened his own. They sat in silence for a while, watching Sal argue with Marcus about the correct way to adjust a carburetor. "You ever ride a motorcycle?" Gary asked eventually. Lucas shook his head. "My mom says they're dangerous." "She's not wrong." Gary took a sip. "But most things worth doing carry some risk. The trick is learning how to manage it." Lucas considered this, turning the bottle in his hands. "Do you have kids?" "Two. Both grown now. Daughters in Seattle, sons in the army." Gary smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't see them as much as I'd like." "Do you miss them?" The question was simple, but it landed somewhere tender. Gary nodded. "Every day." Lucas didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. A recognition, maybe, an understanding that missing people was a language they both spoke. It was Leonora who finally asked the question that had been circling the garage for weeks. She waited until Lucas had finished his dinner, chicken and rice, his favorite so far, and sat down across from him with a cup of tea. "Lucas," she began gently, "does your mom know exactly where you go on Saturdays?" He looked up, surprised by the directness. "Yes. And she's okay with you being here? With us?" Lucas nodded. "She said it's okay if I stay where it feels safe." He paused, picking at a thread on his sleeve. "She's working a lot now. Nights. Since we moved." Leonora leaned forward slightly. "Moved from where?" The boy's eyes dropped to the table. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "From the old apartment. Before Derek." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The name hung in the air like smoke. Heavy, bitter, impossible to ignore. Leonora reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She didn't push for more. She simply held the silence with him, letting him know that whatever he carried, he didn't have to carry it alone. Outside, an engine rumbled to life. Lucas turned toward the sound instinctively, and some of the tension left his face. Leonora watched him, her heart aching in ways she thought she'd outgrown. Now they had a name, and Leonora understood what that meant. Names like that never traveled alone. Leonora couldn't stop thinking about the name. Derek. The way Lucas had said it, quietly, like speaking it too loud might summon something terrible. She had seen that kind of fear before back in her paramedic days. The calls that came in the middle of the night. The women with split lips who insisted they had fallen. The children who flinched when you moved too fast. She didn't share her suspicions with the others right away. Instead, she waited, watched, let Lucas set the pace. It took 3 more Saturdays before the full picture emerged. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, on a cool evening when rain had forced everyone inside the garage. Lucas sat on an overturned crate, helping Gary sort through a box of old spark plugs. The work was simple, repetitive, the kind of task that loosens tongues without meaning to. "My mom's getting better at sleeping too," Lucas said suddenly, not looking up from the parts in his hands. Gary kept his voice casual. "Yeah, that's good. She used to stay awake all night, watching the door." Lucas paused, turning a spark plug over in his fingers. "Derek used to come home late. You never knew what kind of mood he'd be in, so she'd wait, just in case." Gary's hands stilled. He glanced at Leonora, who had stopped pretending to organize the supply shelf. "In case of what?" Gary asked carefully. Lucas shrugged, but the gesture was too tight, too controlled. "In case she needed to get between him and me." The garage fell silent. Outside, the rain continued, indifferent. Marcus, who had been adjusting a brake line nearby, set down his tools and walked outside without a word. Sal stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Gary set aside the box of spark plugs and turned to face Lucas fully. "Is that why you moved? To get away from him?" Lucas nodded. "Mom saved up for months. She had to hide the money so he wouldn't find it. Then one night when he was out, we just left. Took what we could carry and went to a shelter." He finally looked up, his eyes dry but distant. "We stayed there for 5 weeks before we got the new apartment." Leonora moved closer, lowering herself onto a nearby stool. That took a lot of courage. For both of you. Mom says we're safe now. Derek doesn't know where we live. Lucas hesitated, his voice dropping. But sometimes I still hear him. In my head. When it's too quiet, I hear him coming up the stairs. Hear his keys in the door. And I can't breathe. He said it plainly, without drama, as if describing the weather. The flatness in his voice said more than crying ever would. This boy had learned to package his trauma neatly, to carry it without spilling, because showing too much had never been safe. Gary reached out and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. You don't have to hear him here. Lucas looked at the bikes lined up along the wall, their chrome catching the overhead lights. I know. That's why I come. After Lucas fell asleep that night, the men gathered in the office. Dutch closed the door and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. The usual banter was absent. Everyone understood the weight of what they'd learned. So what do we do? Marcus asked. He was the youngest member, barely 25, and his face carried a mixture of anger and helplessness. We don't do anything stupid, Dutch said firmly. Last thing that boy needs is us making things worse by playing vigilante. But we can't just do nothing, Sal argued. You heard what he said. His mom was shielding him from that guy. Who knows what she went through? Leonora spoke up from the corner. We help in ways that matter. Practical things. Things that make their life a little easier without drawing attention. Gary nodded slowly, an idea forming. I could walk Lucas home on Sunday mornings. Make sure he gets there safe. Maybe meet Andrea properly. Let her know we're looking out for him. I can check on their apartment, Sal added. He ran a locksmith business on the side, had for years. Subsidized housing usually means cheap locks. I could upgrade them. Wouldn't cost her a dime. Dutch considered this, then looked at Leonora. What about the legal side? Restraining orders, that kind of thing? I'll ask around. Carefully. Leonora had connections, social workers, advocates, people who knew how to navigate the system without making noise. If Andrea needs help with paperwork or court dates, we can point her in the right direction. The plan took shape quietly, without fanfare. No grand gestures. No confrontations. Just a network of small actions designed to shore up a family still learning how to stand on solid ground. The following Sunday, Gary walked Lucas home for the first time. They took the long way, past the bakery that sold day-old donuts for half price, past the park where early joggers circled the pond. Lucas talked more than usual about school, about a book report he was dreading, about a kid in his class who could solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute. The kind of talk that fills space without asking anything in return. When they reached the apartment building, Andrea was waiting just inside the glass door, visible but not quite outside, a boundary she wasn't ready to cross yet. She was younger than Gary had expected, mid-30s maybe, with tired eyes and a cautious smile. She watched her son approach, then looked at Gary with an expression caught between gratitude and wariness. Thank you for walking him back. Anytime. Gary tucked his hands into his jacket pockets. He's a good kid. You've done right by him. Andrea's composure flickered. Just for a moment, something raw passed across her face. The weight of everything she'd carried alone, suddenly witnessed by a stranger who expected nothing in return. He talks about you all, she said softly. The bikers. He says you leave an engine running so he can sleep. Gary smiled. Guess we do. Andrea blinked rapidly, then pulled Lucas into a tight hug. Over her shoulder, the boy caught Gary's eye and offered a small wave. Gary waved back, then turned and walked home through the brightening morning. Behind him, a mother and son climbed the stairs together, toward a door with brand new locks that would arrive by Wednesday. The months that followed didn't announce themselves. They simply passed, leaving small changes in their wake. Lucas still visited the garage, but the rhythm had shifted. He no longer arrived clutching his pillow like a lifeline. Now he came with questions. How does a clutch work? Why do some engines sound different than others? Can I hand you that wrench? The men welcomed his curiosity. Gary taught him how to check tire pressure, guiding his hands over the valve stem with patient precision. Sal showed him the difference between a deadbolt and a spring latch, explaining why good locks mattered more than most people realized. Even Marcus, who had initially kept his distance, started including Lucas in small tasks. Holding a flashlight steady, fetching tools, learning the names of parts he couldn't yet pronounce. Lucas absorbed it all. He was hungry for knowledge, but more than that, he was hungry for the kind of attention that expected nothing painful in return. Every lesson was a gift wrapped in grease and motor oil, and he collected them carefully. Leonora noticed the changes first. The boy smiled more now. His laughter, once rare and startled, came easier. He still flinched sometimes. Some reflexes take longer to unlearn than others, but the recovery was faster. A drop tool would make him jump, but within seconds he'd shake it off, returning to whatever task occupied his hands. She also noticed he was sleeping better. The circles under his eyes had faded. His shoulders no longer climbed toward his ears at every unexpected sound. The engine noise was still his comfort, but it had become a preference rather than a necessity. One Saturday in late spring, Andrea came to the garage. She arrived in the afternoon, before Lucas's usual time, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The men paused their work, surprised to see her there. She had never visited before. "I made muffins," she said, holding up the basket with a nervous smile. "Blueberry. It's not much, but I wanted to thank you. All of you." Dutch stepped forward and accepted the basket with a nod. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Andrea glanced around the garage, taking in the organized chaos. The bikes, the tools, the cot still tucked in the corner near the parts shed. "But I needed to see this place, to understand why my son feels safer here than anywhere else." Leonora emerged from the kitchen and guided Andrea to a chair near the workbench. The men drifted back to their tasks, giving the two women space while remaining close enough to listen. "He talks about you constantly," Andrea said, watching Gary adjust a chain across the lot. "Gary this, Leonora that. Even the grumpy one with the beard." She gestured vaguely toward Dutch, who snorted but didn't argue. Leonora smiled. "He's a special kid. You raised him well." Andrea's expression flickered, a shadow passing behind her eyes. "I didn't protect him well enough. Not from everything." Leonora thought of her own daughter, grown now, living somewhere in Colorado. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, a distance that had calcified into silence. Protection came in different shapes, and failure wore many faces. "You got him out. That's what matters. I tell myself that." Andrea's voice wavered. "But some nights I still wonder if I waited too long. If the damage was already done before I found the courage to leave." Leonora leaned forward, her tone firm but gentle. "Damage can be repaired. Not erased, but repaired. And that boy is healing. I see it every week. The way he carries himself now, the way he laughs, that's not damage. That's survival turning into something stronger." Andrea pressed her lips together, fighting the emotion rising in her throat. Before she could respond, the gate creaked open and Lucas walked in, backpack slung over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw his mother. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Andrea stood, brushing off her jeans. "I came to say thank you, and to see where you've been spending your Saturdays." Lucas looked around the garage as if seeing it through her eyes. The cluttered shelves, the oil-stained floor, the row of motorcycles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Then he looked at her and shrugged, a grin tugging at his mouth. "It's not so bad, right?" Andrea laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded. She crossed the space between them and pulled him into a hug. Lucas let her, even hugged back, something he'd resisted for months after they left Derek. Gary watched from across the lot. Something settled in his chest. Quiet, unfamiliar, good. Later, as the light turned golden and the day wound toward evening, Lucas helped his mother carry the empty basket to her car. The muffins had disappeared within an hour, devoured by bikers who pretended they weren't touched by the gesture. Before she drove away, Andrea rolled down her window and looked at Leonora, who had walked them out. I didn't know what safe looked like for him anymore, Andrea admitted, her voice quiet. I thought I'd failed him completely, but I think this is it. This strange, loud, wonderful place. Leonora nodded. Safe doesn't always look the way we expect. That night, Lucas didn't stay at the garage. He went home with his mother, climbed into his own bed, and slept through until morning without a single nightmare. Across town, the Grey Pines MC finished their Saturday the way they always did, cleaning tools, sharing stories, winding down beneath the hum of the overhead lights. And before they locked up, Gary walked over to one of the older bikes, turned the key, and let the engine idle for a few minutes, just in case Lucas ever needed to hear it again. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always look the way we think it should, and that the smallest gestures can rebuild what fear has broken. What does safe look like to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more stories that remind us of the goodness in unexpected places. See you in our next video.